Good day everyone, Gummers here with another DCS video, and in this one I want to talk a little bit about two aircraft that were recently announced for DCS, which I'm quite excited about. Now last week Belsamtech gave us a little update on what they are working on at the moment and what projects are coming from them in the future. And on top of helping with the development of the FA-18 Hornet, which appears to be so far one of the most complex modules for DCS, Belsamtech also confirmed that they are working on, first of all, the MI-24P Hind, a truly iconic attack helicopter which I can't wait to fly in DCS. We already guessed that the Hind was in development at Belsamtech, but it is great to finally hear the confirmation that it is indeed coming. The other aircraft that Belsamtech announced was now in development is the F-4E Phantom II, and that one I did not know about. That was a very pleasant surprise. I am very excited about the F-4, even though I expect it to be in development for a long time still, since they just started on it, I think. As I've mentioned in the past, I am a very big fan of third generation fighters and in general combat planes and helicopters from the early 60s to early 80s I find very interesting. And both the Mi-24 and the F-4 fit right in the middle of that time frame. So with those two announced, I figured I'd make a little video and talk a bit about them. Nothing in depth yet, since it will still be some time till we see those two aircraft in DCS, I believe, but a bit of a basic overview. And let's start with the McDonnell Douglas F-4E Phantom II. One of my favorite fighters of all time. Sometimes it was nicknamed the Double Ugly because of its look. I however really like the way it looks, with the dihedral angled up wingtips and all. I think the Phantom just looks dangerous, and that's how a fighter should look like in my opinion. Now, the F-4 Phantom's development started in the 50s as an interceptor and fleet defense fighter for the US Navy, and adoption of the plane in this role started in the 1960s to 61. Having for its time very powerful engines, General Electric J79s, which also powered for example the F-104 Starfighter, but the F-4 has two of them, giving the fighter a great speed and high thrust-to-weight ratio. The F-4 also had powerful radar and weapon load. Being large and heavy though, it wasn't the greatest turner of all times. Now, somewhat uncharacteristically, the Phantom did not stay a pure Navy and Marine fighter in US service. In an attempt to increase commonality in planes and parts between the services, it was decided that the US Air Force should test this new Navy fighter as well. And the Air Force was sufficiently impressed with the Phantom that it also adopted the plane, which is a somewhat unique thing to happen. Usually different requirements of the services prevent that. The version we will get, the F-4E, which entered service initially in 1967, is an Air Force version. To be exact, the last US Air Force fighter version of the Phantom. The F-4G that came after it was a specialized seaplane for suppressing and destroying air defense. We don't know yet which exact lot it will be. The F-5E, which I'm flying here, entered service at a similar time that the F-4E, just a few years later, so that the planes are of the same vintage and there will be some similarities in the technology between the two planes. However, the F-5E was of course developed as a lightweight and cheap fighter, with limited capabilities and very simple systems, with the F-4E of course being the exact opposite, being much bigger and heavier and having much more capability and complex systems, since the F-4 was one of the most capable fighters of its time. So while the technology is the same vintage as the F-5s, the F-4s will be significantly more capable. Speaking of capability, the Phantom occasionally gets a bit of a bad reputation because of its initially unimpressive kill rate in air-to-air combat during the Vietnam War, which, while still positive, was lower than the Air Force and Navy achieved in World War II in Korea. Make no mistake though, the F-4 Phantom was an incredibly powerful fighter at its time, especially the definitive fighter versions, the E for the Air Force we will be getting and the J for the Navy, which ironed out some of the flaws found in earlier versions, were in my opinion the strongest fighters of their time, pretty much till the new 4th generation jets showed up to take that title. So how come it did not do so great in air-to-air engagements over Vietnam then? Well, there were of course some technical issues with the plane at first, but primarily that was a training problem. Now let me explain that a bit. During the late 50s, when the Phantom was developed, it was assumed by aviation experts and brass that the days of traditional dogfights were over and air combat would be fought with new beyond visual range missiles at long range, at high altitude and at supersonic speeds, considered too fast for traditional dogfights. In general, it was assumed that conventional conflicts at large scale would not happen anymore, and instead a future large-scale war would be a nuclear one. And air warfare would, as a result, be mostly about intercepting fast and high-flying bombers carrying nuclear weapons. This belief had effects on both plane design as well as training. The Phantoms, as well as most fighters at its time, were developed as fast interceptors, favoring speed over maneuverability, and the F-4, while very fast and with an for its time extremely good thrust-to-weight ratio, was however inferior in slow speed turning than earlier fighters. Now, that alone was not a new concept. Actually, up to that point, it was always kind of like that to a certain degree. A B-51 Mustang, for example, was also much faster than the older P-40, but not as good at slower speed instantaneous turn rate because of the lower wing loading of the older P-40. So the B-51 was faster, but the P-40 could turn better. And the faster planes were usually the better ones. A B-51 Mustang during World War II with its much higher speed is way superior to the much more maneuverable but much slower Zero, for example, assuming the pilot flying it knows what he is doing. It wasn't until fourth-generation fighters like the F-16 or Su-27 that maneuverability became a much bigger consideration, since by that time better and better missiles made traditional energy fighting tactics harder to pull off. But the missiles of third-generation fighters like the Phantom, especially at the beginning, weren't so good yet, and planes like the MiG-17 it faced did not have them at all. So the F-4 Phantom, not being as good of a turner but faster and with a much better thrust-to-weight ratio than its opposition, should not have been at a disadvantage. It should be the opposite at this point in time. So what was the problem then? Well, we go over that soon. Now, the first big war in which the Phantom would see countless hours of combat was not, however, a purely nuclear one as some had expected, but a very traditional one. Over Vietnam, the Phantom would face MiG-17s, 19s and 21s during Operation Rolling Thunder first, and then later during Operation Linebacker 1 and 2. And a lot of the things that were predicted did not turn out quite the way the experts thought. What a surprise. In combat in Vietnam, the missile armament at the time proved less reliable than hoped. Rules of engagements also forbade attacking targets without visually identifying them first, most of the time, to avoid friendly fire incidents, so the beyond visual range attacks that future air warfare was supposed to be all about was not happening at all. You had to see your target to be able to shoot at it. This led to a lot of close-range maneuvering, the kind of dogfights that were not supposed to happen anymore. Early Phantoms often lacked the close-range dogfight modes we are used to having today, though they were added pretty soon. The F-4 of course famously did not initially come equipped with a gun, thanks to the belief that modern long-range missiles would render it obsolete, though the later E version that we are getting does have one. Not having a gun is of course a disadvantage, especially when the missiles are less reliable and harder to use than today's counterparts. However, the missing cannon and other technical teasing problems were not the main problem, and would be fixed rather quickly in newer versions of the plane that were introduced fast as a result of experiences in combat. The thing is though that the same attitude that led to the Phantom being developed without a cannon also led to a much bigger problem. The air combat training of the pilots when it comes to dogfighting was massively cut, since it was assumed that close-range dogfights were a thing of the past, so why risk accidents in training in it? And that was of course a massive problem when exactly those skills were then needed over Vietnam. So pilots could not develop the skills they needed the same way their predecessors in World War I and over Korea had. And the F-4, while reportedly easy to fly in normal conditions, has some quirks at high angles of attack, like you have to fight in a dogfight. For example, at high angles of attack you can't use the Phantom's ailerons to roll anymore, and you have to use the rudder instead. Something that needs training to get used to and do properly, and also another reason why the F-4 will be an interesting learning experience in DCS. Now, especially problematic here was also that pilots were forbidden from training air combat versus fighter types other than their own at all, because of the assumption that it would be more dangerous if the pilots trained versus opponents with whose flying characteristics they were not intimately familiar with. So an F-4 was only allowed to train versus other F-4s. And as I said, the F-4 had a speed and thrust-to-weight advantage over most fighters at its time, but an inferior turn rate. So by facing planes other than their own, the pilots of the Phantom could have trained for exactly that eventuality. But by fighting only against planes of the exact same capability leads to the development of tactics that simply would not work against completely different ones, like the MiG-17 or MiG-21. Which were inferior to the F-4 Phantom with lower speed, worse high-speed handling and worse thrust-to-weight ratio, but the Phantom still needs to be flown to its strengths in order to use its advantages over those opponents and win. The same way that a superior P-51 Mustang still needs to be flown to its strengths against, for example, a Zero. In a straight-up turning competition, for example, the Mustang will lose despite it being a superior plane. As an example, the famous fighter pilot Robin Olds mentions in his memoirs that when asked about the new gunbots that were delivered for the F-4 Phantom at the time, that he does not like his new pilots using them, because they simply didn't have the same kind of training in this kind of closer range dogfighting he used to have, and were more likely to get in trouble that way. Now, this problem with training was eventually recognized, and the pilots were once again taught what they needed to know about dogfighting and allowed to train it properly. Top Gun and Red Flag were also established for that reason, with adversary squadrons flying A4s and F5s to simulate better turning but slower opponents, like the MiG-17 and MiG-21. And as said before, flown to its strengths, I consider the F-4 Phantom the strongest third-generation fighter in air-to-air combat, only surpassed by the much newer first-generation fighters that came to replace it. Capable of detecting and engaging enemies at, for its time, long range, but also capable of defeating more maneuverable opponents in a knife fight using its superior thrust-to-weight ratio in the vertical. On top of its role as an interceptor and fighter, the F-4 was also a great fighter bomber, capable of carrying quite a large amount of air-to-ground ordnance. Well, those were a few things I wanted to explain about the F-4 Phantom. It's still quite a while away, I would imagine, till we see it in DCS, but at this point it is one of the modules I look forward to the most. I just love this plane. And I think it will be one that is very interesting to learn in DCS with its 70s technology and quirks at high angles of attack. Now let's talk a little bit about the other new module BST announced, the MI-24P Hind. The MI-24 I would expect will be released quite a bit sooner than the F-4 Phantom, since it is supposedly in development since quite a while already, and the F-5 was also announced not too far before its release, but we will see. From what I know, the M24 was already in development in the past, but has been put on hold because it was felt that the helicopter would not work well without multicrew. Now, multicrew is a feature in DCS that seems to progress nicely, and development on the Hind has resumed. Now, as mentioned, the M24 is one of my favorites and one of the modules I was really hoping for would come to DCS. I love the look of the Hind. Like the F4, it surely isn't what you would call pretty, but it looks dangerous, like you don't want to mess with it. So, let's talk a little bit about the Hind. The Mi-24's development started in the late 1960s, and it entered service for the first time in 1973. The original Mi-24A still looked a bit different than the iconic attack helicopter we know today, and originally did not have a tandem cockpit for a pilot and gunner, but instead a large side-by-side glass cockpit with 3 crew members, like on the Mi-8 I fly here, which also has 3. The original layout on the design did not prove satisfactory though. It had a bad field of vision and lacked protection. So with the next version, the Mi-24D, Mill went to the typical 2-man tandem cockpit layout, which gives the Mi-24 its iconic look which we know today. The version we will get in DCS is the later Mi-24P Hind-F, which entered production in 1981. So while I would not call it a new helicopter, it is an 80s version of the Hind. Now, the most notable difference of the Hind-B in comparison to other versions is its gun. Originally, the Hind had a 12.7mm aka 50 caliber machine gun. In the most common D and V versions, it had a 12.7mm Gatling gun in the nose turret, the same Yak-B Gatling gun you can carry in a gunpot on the DCS Mi-8, and I have it on this helicopter. Now the B version, however, replaces this 50 caliber Gatling gun with a fixed twin-barrel 30mm cannon. Now that is a somewhat unique attribute for a dedicated attack helicopter to have a fixed internal cannon like that. While many can carry gunpots that are fixed, the main gun, if the helicopter has one at all, is usually mounted in a turret. Even the 30mm cannon on the K-50 allows some travel and is not fixed completely. But there is a reason why the gun is fixed on a MI-24P. It's huge. The airframe of the helicopter even had to specifically be reinforced to handle the recoil of that cannon. It's going to be the second most powerful cannon on an aircraft in DCS after the A-10 SCOW-8 Avenger. It is basically the same gun you get on the Su-25 Rockfoot, however with longer barrels which allow for a higher muzzle velocity and therefore higher armor penetrating capability. The maximum rate of fire will be over 2000 rounds per minute, though it has an adjustable fire rate, and at the maximum fire rate you can only fire a short burst because the recoil presses the nose down so you can't stay on target long. The gun should be able to deal with everything smaller than the main battle tank though. So that's going to be an interesting weapon to play with, though it is a pity that the gunner doesn't get a turret. The gunner can of course still guide the helicopter's anti-tank missiles. In case of the MI-24P, those are 9K114 Sturm ATGMs with the NATO name 86 Spiral. Those are cyclos guided, like the HOT on the Gazelle or the TOW, meaning that the gunner aims his sight at the target and the missile will automatically be steered by the computer to stay in the middle of the crosshair of the gunner and hit what the gunner is aiming at. Unlike the HOT and the TOW though, the Spiral is not wire guided, but instead radio controlled, so its range is not limited by the wire, and should be for the early versions 5 km and for the later ones 7 km. The sight for those 86 missiles also include a laser rangefinder, and using that the missile can be set to stay above the gunner's line of sight till it is close enough to the target and then drop down to hit what is in the crosshair. That mode is meant for obstacle avoidance. Now the gunner should also be able to point out targets he found with his sight to the pilot on the pilot's HUD. Having the gunner scan for targets with its eyes and magnified optics while the pilot can concentrate on flying the helicopter should be quite a useful option. I always find it a bit inefficient when I fly the K-50 that I can't effectively fly the helicopter to the maximum of its ability and at the same time search for targets with its optical systems. If you do some high-speed Nepopteros flying, you can't constantly stare at the monitor of the Squall and scan around with it. As for the rest of the armament that you can hang on the Mi-24's wings, it should be similar to what we know from the Mi-8 as well as the K-50. S5s and S8 rockets, gunpods and different types of iron bombs. Possibly some air-to-air missiles as well, but I would not count on that. Also, the crew chief should have access to a 7.62mm machine gun to fire from gun ports in the windows of the passenger compartment, to provide some flank protection at close range. Speaking of passenger compartment, this is also a unique feature for an attack helicopter. The Mi-24 has a compartment to carry 8 troops in the back, and therefore can act as a troop transport. Now in reality this idea did not work out so great. As an attack helicopter you don't want the extra weight it brings with it, and if the gunships are landing to get the troops out, those same gunships aren't providing cover during said landing. So the job of troop transport and insertion fell to the Mi-8 again, while the Mi-24s focused on the gunship role. Still, it is a nice option to have and increases the amount of possible missions you can create for the chopper in DCS. Well, that is a bit of a basic overview on the Mi-24P. As I said, I would expect the Mi-24 to show up in DCS a lot sooner than the F-4E Phantom, since it is in development for longer and there should be some system similarities between the Hind and the Mi-8 as well. So I keep it short for now and go into more detail about the Mi-24 when the helicopter is coming out. Well, that is a bit of an overview of the 2 new aircraft announced by Belsamtech for DCS, and this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was informative, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.